Okay, we're now at Daf Samach Vav Amid Beis, and we're up to the Gemara. Now, let's start with the Reisha of the Mishnah, which addresses the case of Chatas Ha'of, and the Mishnah says that if he did a shinui, meaning he somehow deviated from the proper procedure, and that's going to passel the carbon, what was the violation here? How did he in fact deviate from the proper procedure? The Shani B'man. The Gemara is going to go through some possibilities. If you're going to tell me that he messed up on the Malika, which means that he did a Malika that would have been appropriate for an Ola Sof, and he did it in the Chata Sof, well, that works out very well according to Tanakama, because the Tanakama holds that if he implements the Malika of an Ola Sa'of in the case of a Chata Sa'of, that would passel the carbon. But what about Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon? Nemo, should we say that the Mishnah is against Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, the Amar who says, Shamati Shemavdil b'Chata Sa'of, right? That was that radical chiddush that we had at Amud Aleph, that when the Torah says V'lo Yavdil, it means he doesn't have to do Avdullah, but he can do Avdullah, even in the case of Chata Sa'of. That's what we're talking about. And therefore, if you're going to tell me that this is where he messed up, and by doing Havdalah, so he has a situation where his Malika was done with the two simonim vasachas, which means that he's imitating an Ola Sa'of, and that would possibly. But according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, you can't say that, because Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon holds that the procedure that the Torah allows for in the case of Chatas Sof is actually Avdallah. So the Gemara says, "V'lo ukmi delo Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon." So what's so tragic if we say that the Mishnah is like the Chachamim against Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon? Why do you object to such a thing? And in fact, on the sugya on Amud Aleph, we already established that the Mishnah is not like Rabbi Elazar; it doesn't reflect the Shita of Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. But nevertheless, the Gemara wants to suggest that maybe this Mishnah could work out even according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. Lo, the Shani Bazah. So what happens in the case of Shani Bazah? So in the case of a Chatas Ha'of, the avoda requires, number one, hazah, and then whatever's left of the dam, that requires mitzui. But in the case of Ola Sa'of, there is no hazah. There's only mitzui, which we said was the second critical avoda in the case of Ola Sa'of. So now, the Mishnah says that he performed the avoda of an ola for the sake of a chatas ha'of. So that would mean that if he imitated the ola, he completely skipped hazah, the sprinkling. He only did the mitzvah. And that's going to passel the chatos, because if in chatos he only did mitzvah, but he didn't do the first step, which is the essential step of hazah, then the carbon is possible. And that's something that could work out even according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. Gemara says, if we read the Mishnah carefully, at least in the next part of the Mishnah, we'll actually support this interpretation. What does it say? Again, the word sefer means the next part of the Mishnah. kemaisa kulam psula. Vafilu kemaisa chatos l'shem chatos. So he did everything properly, meaning he did the procedure of the chatos, and he had in mind l'shem chatos. But kemaisa kulam, as we said before, in most cases, the hazah should be lamata, but in the case, just 1 second, asah lamala, right? And in most cases, including the chatas ha'of, the hazah should be lamata, and instead asah lamala, meaning he imitated the olas ha'of. The olas ha'of is the carbon, that unique carbon that requires hazah lamala. It's the shani b'mai. What was his deviation here? Ilema the shani b'malika. So you can't tell me that he found the wrong location and he did the malika below the chut hasikra, because anywhere he does the malika on the mizbeach is kosher. El alav, we have no choice. By process of elimination, the shani bazah. Meaning, the makom for hazah, which was meant to be lemata, he did it lemala, imitating the ola, and therefore the chatas is possible. So the Gemara says, "Me the seif hazah is reishanami bazah." So it makes sense that we should interpret even the earlier part of the Mishnah as referring to hazah, and that would support our interpretation that the Mishnah could work out even according to Rabbi Elazar of Shimon. Since the end of the Mishnah deals with Shini Moko, and it's referring to the Mitzui, it's reasonable that the beginning of the Mishnah also is addressing a Shini Moko, referring to the Azaz Hadah. Midi area, so the Gemara rejects it. Hakadisa. There's no proof over here because it doesn't necessarily mean that since you arrived at the conclusion and proved that in the second part of the Mishnah you're referring to a shini makom with regard to hazah, that therefore the first part of the Mishnah also has to refer to a shini makom with regard to hazah. Fakert, it could be that the first part of the Mishnah is referring to a shini in the malika. But again, a shini in the malika would be against Rabbi Elazar of Shimon, and therefore could be that the Mishnah is not like Rabbi Elazar of Shimon. Okay, now the second part of the Mishnah says Olas Ha'of, and again, he deviated in the Olas Ha'of from the proper procedure, therefore the carbon is possible, the Shani B'man. Oh, so what mistake did he do? Ilema the Shani B'malika. Now here we're going to get into laws of Tumah V'Tara. And it's going to be interesting that there are tzvei dinim here in Malika, just like there are parallel tzvei dinim in Shchita. Shchita has two purposes. One, it's matir the basar midei nevel midei or evim nechai. And Shchita also is mitayer midei tumas nevel. So not only removes the isa nevel, but it removes the tumas nevel, which is a tumas beis habliya if he swallows a kezayis of the nevel. He becomes tumah. And in Malika, by parallel, you've got two purposes of Malika. Number one, the Malika accomplishes an avoda, and number two, it removes the tumah of nevelas of tameh. So the Sefer says that kulon ein mitamim bebeis habliya. In other words, even though perhaps his Malika was an improper Malika and it was invalid because of, let's say, Shini Makom, but the Malika remains a Malika. What do I mean the Malika remains the Malika? Again, the Malika cannot be matir the basal achila, the basal the oaf, but it's mafkia tumas nevela. And the same thing applies to Me'ila. Wait a minute. U'molim bahem. Molim bahem. I think we have to put the word but here in. Yeah, but. Yeah, add the word but. But the Me'ila here is going to still apply. Let's just think about that for a second. We're going to, again, this will be a whole sugya, but Me'ila should apply because, now I'm not sure if this is a Doraisa halacha or Daraban halacha, but once it had the din of Kiddush Saguf, then there still remains an Isur Me'ila. That has to be understood. That's going to be a major part of the sugya. But now we have Machlok Shin Rebbe and Rabbi Yeshua, two Tanoim. Nema to lo kir Rabbi Yeshua. I'm sorry, Machlok Shin Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Loza, I meant to say. Yeah. So what's Rabbi Yeshua? The ikir Rabbi Yeshua ha'omar ein mal. In other words, Rabbi Yeshua takes this to its logical conclusion, meaning if you're telling me that the carbon is possible, then why should there be an Isur Me'ila? Okay, just again on a superficial level, that seems to be the argument of Rabbi Yeshua. So now, what we're saying is that the Seif of HaMishnah is against Rabbi Yeshua if you're assuming that the Shinui was B'Malika, because here it says Mo'alimbo, and Rabbi Yeshua is of the opinion of Ein Mo'alim. Rabbi Yeshua holds that Olas Ha'of, where he made a Shinui and he did it below the Chudas Sikra, which is a procedure that's appropriate for the Chatas, but not for the Ola. So then, again, I'm just going to make a statement here that I might regret, but I think what happens is that, in a sense, because he did the procedure of the chatas below the chutas sikra in an ola, so if it now becomes a chatas ha'of, and if he benefits from the basar, he's not in violation of me'ila according to Rabbi Yeshua. But again, this is a sugya later on that we'll have to cover tomorrow, that Rabbi Yeshua holds that if an olas chatos, that he implemented a malika that's appropriate for a, I'm sorry, yeah, that's appropriate for, did I say olas chatos? I meant to say, yeah. I meant to say olas chatos, and he imitated a procedure that's, I'm sorry, not olas chatos. Well, that's a stupid thing. Of chatos are of. And in his chatos ha'of, he imitated the procedure for an olas ha'of. Then the chatos ha'of is not subject to me'ila. That's called ein mol. So Gemara says el b'mitzu. Right, we have no option other than to assume that the shinui here was with regard to the mitzvah. So again, in this part of the Mishnah, where in the Olas Ha'of, he used a shidui by implementing the chatas procedure, which would mean below the chut hasikra. What does it mean he did the chatas procedure? He didn't do the mitzvah adam. And we're talking about it in the Sefer an Ola, and an Ola requires mitzvah adam. So he omitted mitzvah adam, and in that way he imitated the procedure that's appropriate for a chatas. But here he's dealing with an Olas Ha'of. So he did hazah where he was meant to do mitzvah. And since he omitted mitzvah, the carbon is possible. And that means that we're holding now that in the case of chatas ha'of, mitzvah is not critical. Now the Gemara is offering a possibility that would allow the Mishnah to be reconcilable with Rabbi Yeshua, because Rabbi Yeshua holds that in the case of an Olas Ha'of, when he did the procedure of the chatas for the sake of chatas, it becomes a chatas, and it's no longer subject to me'ilah. Now we have to add another point over here, that if in the Avodas Ha'olah he did the malika of an olah and he cut the two simanim, then afterwards there's no possibility of transforming the olah into a chatas, even though he uses the chatas procedure. Let's say he does hazah without mitzvah. So therefore, it's a carbon puzzle, and even Rabbi Yeshua b'modeh that he'd be chayav for me'ilah if he misuses the meat. So the Mishnah can now follow Rabbi Yeshua and nevertheless state that in all these cases, if he's moel, he's chayav for me'ilah, even in the case of an olah where he imitated the chatas procedure of hazah instead of mitzvah, and he did it for the sake of a chatas. Ela seifa olas ha'ov shasol lamata k'maisa chatas l'shem chatas. We're going to have a problem here, because if we assume that in the seifa of the olas ha'ov he did the avodas hadam lamata instead of lamala, and he imitated the Maseches, and Rabbi Elazar Omer Molimbo. Here we have the machlokas between Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Elazar holds Molimbo, Rabbi Yeshua holds Ein Molimbo. And that's the third case in the Mishnah, It's the shani b'mai. What does it mean that in this ola he used the procedure that was appropriate for chatos? I lema b'mitzui. If he did the mitzui, in other words, if he did a shinui in the mitzui, so then we said that there was a shinui in the mitzui, then even Rabbi Yeshua would say that there's me'ilah. Eimer diom Rabbi Yeshua deshani b'malika, but b'mitzui mi omar. When Rabbi Yeshua said ein molimbo, he wasn't referring to a case of a shinui b'mitzui. He was only referring to a case of a shinui b'malika. And since he messed up on the malika, therefore Rabbi Yeshua holds that ein molimbo. It's like the carbon loses its status. But if the malika was appropriate, was valid, and then he made a mistake in the mitzui, then even Rabbi Yeshua would agree that there's no me'ilah. So how could the Mishnah quote Rabbi Yeshua? I'm sorry, even Rabbi Yeshua would say that there is me'ilah. And yet the Mishnah says that Rabbi Yeshua holds ein mo'olimbo, ela b'malika. Now we have to go back and assume that the last part of the Mishnah is referring to a shinui in this olas ha'of regarding malika. Is then reisha v'sefer malika mitziyasa b'mitzui. It's very strange that the beginning and the last part of the Mishnah is referring to malika, but the middle section is referring to mitzui. And the Gemara says, I'm willing to accept that in reisha v'sefer malika mitziyasa b'mitzui. Okay, then let's begin the Mishnah on the bottom third of Samach Vavam Beis. Bekulon ein metam beis abliya. Right, with regard to olas ha'of, chatas ha'of, it makes no difference, and the malika is going to remove the tumas beis abliya. Right, because we said malika is like shchita, it substitutes for shchita, and just like shchita is metar midei nevela, so too, in the case of an oath, the malika is going to be metar midei tumas beis abliya. Umolin bohem. If he misuses them, he's chayav mishum me'ilah. Now, are we referring to the case where he did it the right way? Just 1 second. 20. Trouble is I can't find it. He says the Ola will remain Kodesh Hashem because an Ola is Kulei Kolil, so it's Kodesh Hashem, right? You never matter the basar. But what about the case of a Chatos after the dam is applied to the Mizbeach? That's matter the basar for Kohanim, and it's no longer Kodesh Hashem. And therefore, if a non-Kohen would benefit or eat this basar, he would not be chayav for me'ilah, because there was already a heter achila for Kohen. So it's no longer Kodesh Hashem. Again, all this is assuming that he did the avoda, let's say, for example, of a chatasov properly, and therefore we remove the Isur Me'ila because then the Avodas HaKarban is matir the boss, but at least the Kohen. But in the case of a Chatas Psula, then the Isur Me'ila still exists, persists. So that's as far as a Chatas. So in the case of an Ola, the carbon remains subject to Me'ila, whether it's kosher or not kosher, because it was never a matir on the achilas basar because it's kuli kol. Chutz mi chatos ha'ov she'asa lemata k'maisa chatos l'shem chatos. So again, if it's an invalid chatos, then it's no longer me'ila. Just 1 second. I'm sorry. We're not talking about an invalid chatas. That was my mistake. We're talking about a valid chatas, right? It was asola mata and kemaisa chatas and l'shem chatas. So all the conditions were met. It's a valid carbon, and therefore the avodas adam is matu the basar for achilas kohanim, and therefore there's no longer me'il. Weiter, olas ha'ov shasa lemata kemaisa chatas l'shem chatas. So therefore, in the case of olas ha'ov, you would say the following, that there should be me'ila, because he followed the proceedings of a chatos, is Rabbi Elazar Omer Molinbo, because as we said before, an ola cannot be transformed into a chat, so it remains an ola, and therefore it's Kodesh Hashem, and it remains subject to me'ila. Because once he was magdish the ola the bird as an ola, it is always subject to me'ila. You cannot remove that isa me'ila because there's never going to be a heter on the basar, not even for Kohen. It's kula kola. However, Rabbi Yeshua Omer ein molimba. Since the carbon is not kosher, then the pasas hakarbon removes the isur me'ila, even though there's no heter of the basar, even though it's a carbon ola. Rabbi Yeshua holds that since the Kohen changed the ola with regard to its lishma and its makom, the ola now becomes a chatas with regard to me'ila. Again, that's going to be a hard pill to swallow, but that's coming up later on. And it's a kosher chatos after the dam is applied to the mizbech, and therefore it's mat to the basar, and there's no me'il. So it seems like the machlokas here between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shua revolves around whether or not the shinui in the ola converts it to a chatos. Omer Rabbi Eliezer, uma im chatos she'ein bo molim bo lishma. Meaning, if he had done the avodas hakarbon of the chatos lishma, there would be no me'ila. And the way we explain this, because it's matir the basar b'achila, is kesheshina eshma. And yet, if a chatos was brought shelo lishma, is then molimbo. Because the chatas was shechted l'shem ola, and everybody agrees that in that case there is me'ila. which means it quasi becomes like an ola, where there's me'ila. Is therefore comes along Rabbi Elazar with a kavachor, and he says ola shemol and bol shma, right? Even in a case where he had the right kavanas lishma in the ola, and nevertheless there's still an isa me'ila. Whereas in chatos, if he did it lishma, there would be no isa me'ila. But in the case of an ola, since there's no matir of the basar, it remains kodesh Hashem, and therefore there's me'ila. Is kishina shema. If instead he had a machshava of l'shem chatos, enu din sheyimalu bo. Certainly, we should be more machmir with regard to me'ila in the case of an ola than we were in the case of a chatos. Because in chatos we said that if he did the avodas hachatos l'shma, there's no me'ila. It's matir the boss, and therefore there's no me'ila. Then in the case of an ola, how much more so should there be me'ila? Because in a chatos, if he's meshana eshma, and he had in mind for the sake of an ola there is me'ila, how much more so in the case of an ola? If that's true for chatos, it has to be true for an ola. Rabbi Yeshua responds, Lo amarta b'chatos sheshina shmo l'shem ola. In the case of a chatos where he had a machshava of shalol l'shma and he wanted to be makriv the chatos for the sake of an ola, and we said he's chayiv me'ila, the shinui was for the sake of an ola. And if the shinui was for the sake of an ola, then an ola is always subject to me'ila. Tomar, can you draw conclusions? Be ola sheshina shmol l'shem chatos, shekain shina shmol l'davar she'ein bo me'ila. Right? Chatos as a concept does not lend itself to me'ila, meaning if he does the avodas hakorban properly and he's matir the basa, there's no me'ila. So you can't derive any conclusions about me'ila in the case of an ola regarding shinui shma. And use a kal v'chomer to derive the conclusion that ola is more subject to me'ila than chatos, and therefore certainly there should be me'ila in the case of an ola. The answer is no, because the shinui here in the case of an ola was going from me'ila to non-me'ila. It was going from ola to chatos. He had in mind the same chatos, and chatos is not subject to me'ila if the avoda was done proper. Now, on the next Amud, we still have the second half of this Mishnah where Rabbi Elazar is going to go back. I suggest we start that fresh tomorrow. And we'll be more able to summarize the Mishnah, I think, tomorrow.